Okay, I'm now recording the presentation. I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening, Judy Cardin. Judy is a trainer and identification verifier with the Wisconsin DNR Bumblebee Brigade. Judy was trained and mentored on bumblebees and native plants by Susan Carpenter, UW Arboretum, where she also volunteers. She has photographed and identified thousands of bumblebees and flowers for research surveys. Judy is also the administrator of the Wisconsin Bumblebee Observer's Facebook page and has authored Rusty Patched Bumblebee Floral Phenology, distributed by the USGS and Wisconsin DNR. A link will be included in the handouts, and the links will be posted in the chat box. Again, please remember to put your questions in the chat box and keep yourself on mute. Because we do have, Judy's using an iPad to do her presentation, there will be a little picture down in the corner we can't seem to figure out how to get rid of. It'll be a picture of me and my dog. Just kind of ignore that. Hopefully that doesn't block anything. So without further ado, Judy's topic this evening is the buzz in your garden, attracting, identifying, and sustaining bumblebees. Please join me in welcoming Judy.
Thank you, Chris. What a great week to have a talk about bumblebees and gardens. We had our first bumblebee queen show up in our yard this week, and that's been happening across the southern part of the state. We've had many reports of the queen showing up, and very importantly, my Dutchman's breeches went into bloom today, which is a bumblebee magnet. So I'm excited to talk to you about my two favorite subjects, flowers and bumblebees. So we're going to cover how to make your yard a healthy ecosystem where pollinators and bumblebees, especially the endangered rusty patch bumblebee, can thrive. My husband and I are community scientists, and we've observed and photographed thousands of bumblebees and flowers. I use those observations to compile the rusty patch bumblebee floral phenology report that Chris mentioned is going to be, a link to that will be in chat. And what I did is we used observations of rusty patch that we had over a 3-year period. And during this presentation, we're going to look at the flowers that I recommend to sustain the rusty patch based on those observations. In addition to looking at the season-long best flowers and habitat, we'll talk about why bumblebees really need our help and when you can expect to see bumblebees in a healthy native yard. Finally, I'll help you identify the bumblebees in your garden and answer any questions you have. Okay, first let's look at why bumblebees do need our help. 50% of species nationwide of native bee species have disappeared over the last century. Many bumblebee species are disappearing nationwide. We have 4 species that have declined by 96% and 3 species that are likely extinct. There are 2 Wisconsin species that have not had observations for over 20 years and very possibly no longer live in the state of Wisconsin. A quarter of bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. If you look at this map, you can see that this is the map that shows the former range of the rusty patch bumblebee, which is the red and the green dots, and the current range is that small cluster of green dots. And what's happened is the rusty patch has declined by 90%, and they are a federal endangered species. As you can see from where those green dots are very much clustered in and around the state of Wisconsin, we are their best hope for survival, and our actions will make a difference. So what has caused the decline? Disease, habitat and native flower loss, and pesticide and herbicide use are the likely culprits. But what can we do to help? Each of us, with every flower we plant, can make a difference. I've been gardening for over 45 years. The first 35 years, I shaped and planted my yard with flowers from all over the world to create my own flower landscape. And then I realized gradually over the last 10 years that I need to allow my yard to be part of the natural landscape that will support native wildlife. Bumblebees and all pollinators need us to transition from large turf lawns and non-native plants to natural ecosystems that will sustain them. We can do that by providing large, natural, chemical-free corridors in our yards, planted with native nectar and pollen-rich flowers that bloom through the entire growing season. So why are native plants important to bumblebees? Native flowers provide the right nutrients and medicinal qualities for native bumblebees. Bees will use introduced flowers, but they won't receive the quality of nectar and pollen that with the native plants that they evolved with. Native relationships between native plants and pollinators evolved over thousands of years, and they do provide the most sustainable habitat. They also support a greater abundance of pollinators and can help mitigate climate change because they are able to adapt and change. We're going to look at some examples of flowers that just make it so clear why it's important to have native plants as a substantial part of your garden, where we'll see some flowers that have very clearly specifically evolved for a bumblebee to pollinate. The bumblebee needs them and they need the bumblebee because of those thousands of years of gradual evolution together. Dr. Doug Ptolemy is an expert on plant-insect interactions, and he really at this point has devoted his life to trying to help people understand how threatened insects are right now under the current conditions, and how important it is that we are doing everything we can to protect them, because a healthy insect population means a healthy wildlife population, means a healthy plant population, and it really means a healthy human population. His research demonstrates the importance of natural landscapes in your yard to sustain wildlife. One of his landmark research studies was that he found that native landscapes greatly improve wildlife sustainability. He found in one of this important study that introduced landscapes produced 75% fewer caterpillars. The cascading effect was that resulted in 60% fewer breeding chickadees. The birds that did breed had fewer eggs and fewer fledglings. His message is that insect-plant interactions affect the entire ecosystem profoundly. Providing native plants and natural landscapes in our yard is fundamental to helping threatened species recover. This graph demonstrates from his research that in order to sustain wildlife like bumblebees, if you reach a ratio of 70% native plants to 30% introduced non-invasive species, and right here is where that divide happens, that wildlife is able to replace itself at that ratio of native plants to introduced plants. So my goal is, my yard right now is not 70% native plants, and my goal is to transition my yard so that it is 70% native plants. And I can't do that overnight. We had 30 some years of not focusing on native plants. And so what we're doing is we're actually converting our front yard into native plant corridors. We're going to have about 7 different corridors instead of a lawn in our front yard. And we've already got a woodland backyard. And as we're replacing some of the non-natives and some of the invasives that we have in our backyard, we're making sure that all replacements and all new plantings are native plants. Dr. Ptolemy also recommends including keystone species in your native landscape. He determined the keystone species by looking at what plants support the majority of caterpillar species and the resulting food web stability. His amazing result is that 14% of plants support 90% of caterpillars. Those plants are the keystone species. Including these keystone species in your yard helps build healthy food webs that sustain all wildlife. You can find the keystone species and other native plants for your area using this very helpful native plant finder. The link to this is in the chat resources. And all you have to do is plug in your zip code and it will tell you all of the native plants for your zip code area. And it will also list that indicator that Dr. Ptolemy has used, which is how many caterpillars use that particular species, so that as you choose new plants, to include in your landscape, you have a good idea of the impact on wildlife. What about cultivars, or nativars, as some people call them? What about a plant that's native to the region that has been cloned or otherwise engineered to be a cultivar? He advises caution. Some of them are fine, but altering the flower may change the ability to deliver pollen and nectar. And in addition, he doesn't believe, because there is a lot of cloning involved in cultivars, that they usually can't adapt to environmental changes like a native plant can. And there's a lot of adapting going on right now with all of the temperature change that's occurring. A great use of keystone tree species, and some of the examples of that in Wisconsin are oaks, cherries, maple, aspen, and birches, is Heather Holmes' concept of soft landings. What she suggests is that you plant diverse native plants under the drip line of native trees. Then you leave the leaves, the plant debris, and the rodent holes. Over time, that area will develop a rich woodland humus soil. And the woodland areas that you create under these trees provide great habitat for pollinators. This is a perfect place for spring ephemerals, which we're going to look at in a moment, that supply critical food for bumblebee queens. The humus soil, sheltered by leaves and plant debris, is good bee hibernation habitat, and the rodent holes and debris provide good nesting material. So here's a summary of the steps that we can take to help sustain pollinators, including bumblebees. First, reduce turf lawn. Maintain a natural ecosystem in your yard. Develop plant corridors and soft landings of native plants that include keystone species, spring ephemerals, and additional bumblebee flowers that we're going to be talking about shortly. Keep your landscape chemical-free. Pesticides obviously will harm insects, but recent studies have also indicated that fungicides and herbicides harm bee larvae, which of course hurts the long-term well-being of the bumblebee population. Let's take a virtual walk through a healthy native corridor. So first, use native plants that have evolved with the local insects. Plant big patches of each plant for foraging efficiency for the bumblebees. Allow your garden soil to be natural. Don't use weed cloth or heavy mulch. An established, healthy native plant ecosystem requires little weeding. Leave the leaves, the twigs, and the plant debris for nesting and hibernation habitat. And please help people learn about natural pollinator-friendly gardens. So, when should we see bumblebees in a yard with a healthy ecosystem? To help you understand that, I'm going to walk through the annual bumblebee life cycle now, and show you the population phenology of Wisconsin bees. So if you look at this diagram up there in number 1, you see a queen bee who is in her hibernation chamber. That's where she spends the winter. So the cycle starts in early spring when those queens emerge from the underground hibernation chambers and need to immediately forage for food because they just spent several months not eating, living off their fat stores, and it's really essential that they have food available as soon as they emerge. So they're going to need those nearby plants. She also needs to find a nest site, which is a rodent hole is a very common nest site for a lot of bumblebees. They also use grass mats. They can use other, any hole they find in a building structure is a possibility. And you see in diagram number 2 there, what she then does is she builds wax pots once she's selected that nest site that will hold nectar and pollen, which she needs to collect on her own. And then she lays her eggs in the pots. It takes about a month for the first brood of female workers to reach adulthood. The adult workers take over foraging food and raising the young, and then the queen dedicates herself to laying eggs once that first brood reaches adulthood, which is what you see down in number 3 on that on the diagram. Adult workers only live about a month, so successive broods need to replace early workers plus add workers for the nest to be successful. The purpose of the nest is producing new queens to carry on the next generation. So in late summer and early fall, the nest switches from producing workers to producing only new queens and males. Once that's accomplished, the nest disorganizes. Only the new queens will survive the winter. They feed in fall time to build up food stores to see them through the winter. And then they dig a shallow chamber in the ground to hibernate until spring. Now let's look at what specifically happens to bumblebee populations by month in Wisconsin. What I did is I took some data from the Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade, and I looked at the last 3 years, what the population of bumblebees was by month. And the Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade is a community science organization administered by the Wisconsin DNR. You can be a citizen scientist and submit photos of bumblebees to the Bumblebee Brigade website. And the link for that is on the resources page in chat. And experts will verify the identity of the bee that you submitted. The data is then used to manage bumblebee populations in Wisconsin. So this chart I put together shows the populations by month. And you can see in April, which is where we are right now, when the queens are just starting to emerge from their hibernation, we have a very low bumblebee population because the only thing flying are those emerging queens. So April's a month where you're much less likely to see a bee unless you have some of the flowers in your garden that the queen is looking for. Then in early May, it's still the queens, and you can see the population is still low. But what that little blue part of that line is, the first workers are starting to mature and emerge from the nest towards the end of May. But again, a low population month in May, and you're a little less likely to see bees in May than you will later in the summer. And you can see that continues to progress in June. The number of workers is growing in June, but then if you look at it in July, you can see that that number of workers is peaking then. And the peak populations when you are likeliest to see bees are going to be July and August. Then in September, you can see the population really declines rapidly. That's when the production of the workers has ended, and most of the nests have completely disorganized by then. And all that you're seeing flying are the males that are out flying looking for new queens to mate with, and the new queens that are out usually feeding and getting ready to hibernate. And then the females that you see, there's just a few females left that are no longer participating in the nest, but are just at that point eating and surviving until the weather gets too cold. So what do we need? What are the survival needs in April and early June for those queens that are emerging? They need good nest habitat, and they need early April bumblebee flowers in order to survive and be able to successfully start a nest. A lot of queen bees are not successful in starting a nest because they don't have one or the other of those essential requirements. She raises that first brood on her own, which is very energy intensive. So if she is successful in finding a nest site, laying the eggs, and starting to raise the young, if she has to expend too much energy flying to find flowers with good pollen and nectar, again, the nest could fail. By June, the workers are foraging and caring for the young. The workers only live about a month again, and in a thriving nest, each brood is larger so that earlier worker numbers are replaced and more workers are available to gather food. In July and August, these extra workers are essential to produce the new queens who require extra food and care. The peak population bumblebees in July and August require a peak population of flowers in order to sustain the nest through that peak population time. In September and October, again, it's males and the new queens are flying, so bee populations are very low, but the native flowers are also much sparser, and having the right flowers in bloom is critical to the survival of the new queens. The new queens dig a shallow hibernation chamber in the ground, and they need that rich humid soil with sheltering leaf and plant debris in order to find a sheltered spot that they're able to dig their chamber. So I guess the important message is that spring queens that can't find nearby early spring flowers and nest sites, and fall queens that can't find late blooming flowers and hibernation sites mean the loss of that line of bumblebees. Next, we're going to look at what are the good flowers to plant for the rusty patch bumblebee. I compiled this report on rusty patch bumblebee using the observations that Bob and I made of nearly 500 rusty patch bumblebees visiting flowers over a 3-year period. So my flower recommendations are based on these observations and on a couple of other studies that have been done on rusty patch flowers. But the flowers I'm recommended are also widely used by other bumblebees and pollinators. This chart from the Rusty Patch Flora Phenology report shows by week what flowers we observed Rusty Patch bumblebees using throughout the growing season. If you'd like to see the complete report and look at it a little bit more closely, again, the link is in the resources PDF. Based on our observations and some research studies, I compiled the list that we're about to look at of Rusty Patch bumblebee flowers that would sustain them from early April through October. And we're going to look at those recommendations. The recommendations that we're looking at are going to be for native flowers. If you look at this chart, you can see it's quite a mix because rusty patch bumblebees, like all bumblebees, they're going to find food where they can find it so they can survive and they can accomplish their goal of reproducing. So they aren't saying, is this a native plant or is this a non-native plant? They're saying, I need to have nectar and I need to have pollen now, what's most available with the least expenditure of energy. So there's a lot of non-natives here. There's some invasives on this list that they're using. But I guess the key to remember, the reason I'm recommending natives is that the nutrition that they are getting from those non-natives does not equal in quality and in medicinal values and in other properties the pollen and nectar that they can get from the native plants that they've evolved with. So we're first going to look at during April and May when the queens emerge from hibernation and they need that ready access to nearby flowers. And as I mentioned, my favorite native flower in April is Dutchman's breeches, and it really is a bumblebee queen magnet. We've seen several rusty patch queens using it, and this is what you're looking at right now is a photo of a rusty patch queen on Dutchman's breeches. And all of the bees that we're going to look at in these April and May flowers are rusty patch queens. And one thing you'll notice, just an identification tip, is the rusty patch queen actually doesn't have a rusty patch. The workers and the males have this very distinctive rusty patch that we'll be looking at a little bit later in the presentation, but the queens do not. So this spring, based on some research studies, in addition to the Dutchman's breeches, which is just a fundamental plant to have available in your yard for the rusty patch in April, we're also going to be planting spring beauties, native gooseberries and currants, and then we've also decided to plant some pussy willow in our yard. Those are all great bumblebee flowers that the rusty patch can use. Virginia bluebells is another spring ephemeral and another bumblebee queen favorite. They usually start blooming in our yard in late April, and then they bloom through May. As you can see in this photo of the rusty patch queen, that is, she's actually appears to be nectar robbing. I'll explain what that is. But queens are very large. Sometimes they're twice as large as the workers. And the bee size varies by species, but the rusty patch queen is one of the largest. She's a very, if she's using your flowers, you'll probably notice her. I mentioned nectar robbing. One of the survival techniques that the rusty patch has had to learn is that they have a very short face and they have a very short tongue. So when they're trying to get nectar from a flower that has a long throat on it, they cannot physically sometimes reach that source of nectar at the base of the flower. And so what they will do is they will actually probe a hole above the nectar source and take the nectar directly from there rather than going through past the anthers and actually doing some pollination of the flower. All right, Virginia waterleaf is another spring woodland plant favored by queens. It has a long bloom time. We usually have it blooming throughout May and June in our yard. The queens and the females gather pollen and carry it back to the nest to feed the larvae. And the queens, there's a good example here of that carrying pollen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens there. Bumblebees have evolved a barbed hair structure that captures pollen all over their bodies when they visit flowers. Thus, when they go from flower to flower, they're carrying pollen from flower to flower. But what they'll do is every once in a while, they'll stop and they will groom that pollen down from throughout their body, down into the pollen baskets. And right here on this hind leg is where the pollen basket is. And they gradually fill that with, it's a combination of nectar and pollen. So it's kind of a solid, a viscous solid that sticks to the pollen basket. And they continue foraging until the pollen basket is full, and then they return to the nest. Pollens can be a great variety of colors. In this case, it's kind of a brown color, but I've seen them bright yellow, pale yellow, white, brown, blue, various shades of orange. You know, different flowers have different colored pollen. So this is shooting star. And it's a May woodland flower that only produces pollen, not nectar. The protein in pollen is necessary for the growth of the larva. And this is an example of where a flower has very much evolved with bumblebees so that they do exactly what each other need to survive and reproduce. So this flower has evolved to produce the most important nutrient to feed larvae exactly when that first brood of larvae need it. The anthers hang down and the petals point to the sky. They are only pollinated by bumblebees and one other native bee. And it's really fun to watch this happen. The bee it's called buzz pollinating. She'll hang upside down, grasping those anthers to her abdomen, and then she strongly vibrates her flake muscles, and she shakes the pollen onto her abdomen, which results in a very large, loud buzzing noise, thus the name buzz pollination. But it's just a perfect, there's so many of these examples, but this is a perfect one that, the two species, this flower could not exist without the bumblebee, and the bumblebee would have a more difficult time if it weren't for shooting star. Okay, another Mayflower is the native plum tree. And the native plum is a small tree that grows to about 20 to 25 feet tall. It is a keystone species. So we're adding this to our yard, both because the rusty patch bumblebees use it quite a bit during May. And May is a little bit of a sparse time for flowers for queens. But it's also extremely valuable to butterflies. Again, it's one of Dr. Ptolemy's keystone species. It will form a thicket and it has thorns, so you need to select a site with that in mind. It's a woodside edge species and can grow in sunny conditions. One of the resources that will be available in the PDF is I put together a chart of all of these flowers that I'm recommending with the name of the flower, and I'm using the common names, but the name of the flower is linked to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. So you will also have access to the scientific name. Plus, if you're familiar with the Lady Bird Flower Center website, they have extensive information on what kind of growing conditions are best for each species. So June is when that first brood of workers reaches adulthood and starts foraging. Since the queen was on her own incubating eggs and feeding and raising larvae, the first brood is very small. It's only 6 to 8 workers. The individual bees are often also physically smaller because of the stress on that queen of doing everything on her own. She isn't able to feed the young and care for the young as extensively as a brood of workers is. If the queen was too stressed finding food, that first brood can be so physically small that it affects the vitality of successive broods. So June flowers are important so these small workers can easily find food and help grow the nest population. Wood betony is a low-growing plant that blooms from May to June. Early June, again, is a somewhat sparse time for bumblebee flowers, and betony fills an important niche. It's low-growing, and it's interesting, it's semi-parasitic. It gets some of its nourishment from the roots of other plants that grow around it. And part of this is the evolution of how wood betony has survived, and that using that nutrition doesn't necessarily kill the plant, but it could result in a smaller stature of the plants around it, which then benefits the low-growing betony so it can get sun and nutrients that it needs. And wood betony you can plant in either sun or semi-shade. Another great June flower is St. John's wort, and I think all bumblebees love St. John's wort. It is a great pollen plant. And it's beautiful. And the flowers are the plant itself is a long blooming plant. There are many cultivars of it. There are some natives also in Wisconsin. Great St. John's wort, a Wisconsin native, blooms in early June and July. Anise hyssop is a workhorse bumblebee flower that you can plant in sun or shade, and it blooms from June through August, a very long blooming time, and is heavily used by rusty patches and other bees. So July and August, that's that peak population time. Successful nests that started with only 8 workers in June have multiplied many times in populations. There was a rusty patch nest that was recently found in the Midwest that had close to 1,000 workers. So if you think of that incredible growth going from 8 workers to 1,000 workers, that takes a lot of flowers, to make that happen. At this time of year, the nests are close to completing their goal of producing new queens, but available flowers will make all the difference in how successful they are. There's a top 4 flowers that my report plus multiple, there's 2 or 3 other rusty patch flower reports. They have a very similar group of flowers that are kind of the top nectar and pollen producers for rusty patches and it's during this period because this is when the most bees are out gathering the most flowers, the most nectar and pollen. So those are the flowers that you're going to see the most bees on. Wild bergamot, or sometimes known as bee balm, is one of the top 4 flowers used by rusty patches during this high production period. And depending upon conditions, it can bloom all the way from May through September, but July and August are really the most widespread blooming months. It can grow in semi-shade and full sun, and it can grow in both moist and dry conditions. It's a very tolerant, easy to grow plant that can reach 5 feet tall. We have a lot of this in our corridors, and it really is very easy to grow. And not only do bumblebees love it, but butterflies use it heavily also because it is a nectar producer. Culver's root, which blooms from July through August, its peak bloom time is from late July to early August. And of course that depends on, seasonally that can depend, but that's typically what we see. That corresponds to the very peak bumblebee and rusty patch populations. And we observed rusty patches visiting Culver's root more than any other flower during that peak time of late July to early August. So a very important flower to the rusty patch bumblebee. It's very adaptable to gardens and can be planted in sun or part shade. It can grow from 2 to 6 feet tall, and it's perfect for a woodland edge. Mountain mint is another top 4 flower for the rusty patch. It's just a lovely little flower. I like to just sit and look at it close because it's a very delicate, small flower, and it's just beautiful. It has a lovely white and purple flower, and it grows to about 3 feet tall. It likes semi-shade and moist soil and has a long bloom time. Giant hyssop grows to 5 feet tall and can tolerate either sun or shade. And again, it attracts both butterflies and bees. The New England aster has long bloom time from August all the way through October. And I think it has just a beautiful flower. And it blooms late in the season when flowers start becoming very scarce. It prefers part shade, but it can also grow in sunny areas. Flowers start waning quickly in September, and by October, they've almost disappeared. The queen bees need food to build up fat to survive the winter, so the next flowers we look at are very important to those fall queens preparing to go into hibernation. Field thistle is a hard sell in an urban garden, but the flower is actually very beautiful. Queens, including the rusty patch queen in this photo, use them heavily. They bloom from July through September, and native thistles are not as prickly and armored as the introduced and invasive thistles. Joe Pyeweed is another top 4 flower for the rusty patch. It blooms August through September when the new queens, like this rusty patch queen, really need them. Obedient plant has a gorgeous flower and it will grow in sun or shade. It attracts bees and butterflies and it blossoms through October. Showy goldenrod lives up to its name. It will add gorgeous color to your fall yard. It likes part shade and it blooms primarily August through September. I love this image of a beautiful shiny new rusty patch queen feeding on spectacular showy goldenrod. We'll end our season-long tour with this shot of an October rusty patch queen on the only flower that was blooming when she needed it, the New England aster. And I think the image says that all. So here is the list by approximate bloom times for the flowers that we just talked about. And again, in the, if you want to download the information, I put together a list of these flowers by bloom time, and I linked those to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center so you can get further information on each of them. All right, well, now we're going to learn how to identify those bumblebees that are buzzing in your garden. So bumblebee identification can kind of be as complicated as you want to make it. And I thought it would be a good idea if we keep it simple enough tonight so that you can identify the majority of the bumblebees that you see in your garden. So what I did is I looked again at that information from the Bumblebee Brigade. And there are 19 species of bumblebees that have been observed over the last decade in Wisconsin. But what I looked at is, how many do we have to look at to get to 90% of the bumblebees that are being observed? And there are 8 species. And if you look on the graph right here, we have these 8 species, which is this group of bees right here. Those observations comprise 90% of the observations of bumblebees. So the first thing we're going to do to simplify is we're going to just look at identifying those 8 species, which you're most likely to see. The next thing that we're going to do then to simplify, and here's that list again of what we are going to be looking at, is since most of what you're going to see in your garden are going to be those female workers, we're going to look at identifying the female workers of those 8 species. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can tell a male from a female, just so if you see an odd looking bee, you'll have an idea of what you're looking for, or what the difference could mean. So we're going to look at those identification characteristics for those eight species and the female workers. You can identify some bees on the fly, but the best method is to take a few pictures with your smartphone or another camera. And when I say a few pictures, you want to take several pictures, because we're going to look at a lot of pictures that show some very good views of bumblebees. But trust me, I sorted through a whole lot of pictures that didn't give good views of bumblebees in order to find, the shots that we're looking at today. Their bumblebees are flying and moving, and their wings get in the way of seeing some of their various parts, and parts of flowers can get in the way. So you want to take enough pictures that when you look at the photos afterwards, you have enough to say, I can see the characteristics I need to see to identify this bee. And what you want to try to do as much as possible is to take photos of views of the bee, both from the top of the bee and the side if possible, because each view can tell you something about the bee. When we start looking at these species, we're going to look at photos from the side and from the top. And I think you'll understand what I mean after we do this. In addition to maybe not always being able to get a photo that shows the characteristics that would be most helpful. The bees are sometimes not helpful in that they can vary quite a bit. We're going to talk about what you will usually see for physical characteristics, but bees, like any other form of life, can have a lot of variety and diversity, so that sometimes you'll have an unusual characteristic show up on a bee. And what I'm going to try to have you look at tonight is, if you look at a combination of 2 or 3 characteristics on each bee, it should give you a very good idea of what species you're looking at. So if you are struggling with an idea and you'd like some help with it when take your photos and you look at them afterwards and you can't quite sort it out, there are 2 good sources of information for identifying bees. There's the Bumblebee Brigade website, which we had talked about, and a link for that is in chat. And then there's also the Wisconsin Bumblebee Observers Facebook page, and I'm one of the administrators of that page. And we do a lot of bumblebee identification, plus a lot of other information on flowers and bumblebees. And the link to that is also in chat right now on the PDF. So what we're going to look at, what I have up here is the Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade Field Guide for Female Bees, and you'll be able to get this on the link that's in chat right now. But what we're going to do is look at 4 characteristics for each of the species of bumblebees, and then we're going to look at, for each individual species of those 4 characteristics, what are the most important that are going to help you most quickly identify that bee. We're going to look, the 4 characteristics we're going to look at is the face, the color of the hair on the front of the face. We're going to look at the color of the hair on the top of the head and the nape of the neck. We're going to look at the color of the thorax patch, which rests on top of the back between the wing pads. And then we're going to look at the colors on each of the abdominal sections, which are called terga. And they're abbreviated T1 through T6. The female bumblebee has 6 abdominal sections. One of those differences between a male and a female is that a male has 7 abdominal sections. So it's easier on some bees than others to actually see these lines that separate the sections. But the other thing that you'll see on a female very often is the stinger point. Only the female bee can sting. So only the female bee has a stinger point on the end of her last abdominal section. The male just has a tuft of hair. And one of the other differences that you can see that will tell a male from a female is only the females carry pollen back to the nest. So that broadened area that we looked at on that rusty patch queen where she was gathering pollen, the males don't have that. They have a narrow hind leg without that flat broadened patch. Okay, the first bee that we're going to look at now is the common eastern bumblebee. So we're going to see 2 things. We're going to start with looking at, from that field guide, what those 4 characteristics are. And then on each of the first species page here, we're going to see a map that shows you the range where that bee has been observed in Wisconsin from the Bumblebee Brigade observation data. So the common eastern bumblebee has a black face, a yellow vertex, and then one of the 2 distinguishing features. So what you want to remember about the common eastern bumblebee is this thorax patch is unique to a common eastern bumblebee. It is a large squarish area, and we'll see an example of it in a minute on a photo. And it's intermixed yellow and black, and there's very often a wave pattern to the yellow that we'll be looking at. But no other bumblebee has that type of thorax patch. Then the most distinguishing feature for the common eastern bumblebee, our most common bee, is that only the first abdominal section is yellow. All of the others are black. And it is the only bumblebee in Wisconsin that has T1 yellow and everything else black. So let's take a look at a couple of pictures. So we have the face. The face of a common eastern can have just a tiny bit of yellow like this one has, but it's essentially a dark face. You see that yellow top of the head. You can't make out the thorax patch on this side view. That's why you want to get both a top view and a side view, because the top view is usually what's going to give you a good look at the shape and color of the thorax patch. But you can see there is just that one abdominal section that is yellow. And that, again, the most important feature is that first abdominal section. If that's obscured and you can't get a look at it, then you want to get a look at that thorax patch. And let's take a look at that. Just a couple of other things here. This is that broadened pollen basket area that we were talking about on a female. She's not carrying any pollen in it yet, but on a male, that's going to be very narrow. Okay, so this is that overhead view. And you can see very clearly that very large squarish intermixed yellow and black thorax patch. And that's that wave pattern right there that I was talking about. And here you can see, you can see the sections fairly clearly on this bee, and just that first section is yellow. Sometimes what'll happen, I can actually see through the wings here, but sometimes you'll have a photo and the wings are dark enough and close together enough that you can't make out the center of that section. And the center of that section is important because we're going to look at a couple of bees in just a second here, where that center part of T2 has some color in it. And you know, you might not be able to tell that if you've got the wings obscuring things. That's when you're going to go to this thorax patch and say, huge square intermixed, that's a common eastern. All right, so the next bee that we're going to look at is the two-spotted bumblebee. And again, we have a black face, and again, we have a yellow vertex. But here we have a small thorax patch, and the most distinguishing feature on a two-spotted bumblebee, it's got a yellow T1, but the most distinguishing feature is this T2. There's this yellow W shape that almost all two-spotted bumblebees have, which is why they're called a two-spotted bumblebee. Very occasionally, you'll find one that has more of a square section centrally there, but over 90% you're going to find with that W. All right, here's a side view now of the bee, and we could see the black face. We could see the black top of the head. We can't make out the thorax patch because we're looking at the side. What we can see here is that there's T1 is yellow, and from the side, all we can make out is this is only partially yellow, only the center is yellow, which gives you a good idea. It might be a two-spotted, but we're going to want that overhead view to see what the shape of that T2 yellow is. And just to point out, this is a stinger point right here on the female. All right, here's the overhead view. And you can see that most important feature there. It's a very clear W on T2. And if you see that W, you know that you have a two-spotted bumblebee. We're going to look at our third most common bee now, the brown-belted bumblebee. And we have a black face, we have a black vertex, usually a very small thorax patch. The first segment is yellow, and now the most important feature on a brown-belted is T2, because there will be a brown half moon typically on T2. Some bees, that brown will creep up into the first section, but you will have this brown half moon. So what I mean by half moon is that the center part will be brown, and then it'll decrease as it approaches the edge of the section. Now let's look at a couple of photos. So we have the black face, we have the black top of the head. Can't totally make out the thorax patch, but you can see it's pretty small in this view. We have that first abdominal section yellow, and then we have the tan half moon, and you can see that the center of the section is more fully brown, and then you can see that little bit of brown going to the edge to create that half moon. The brown can vary quite a bit. It can be the lightest of browns and the darkest of browns. All right, let's look at the overhead view, and you can see the small thorax patch, and then you can see that brown half moon. So if you see a brown half moon like this, you know that you've got a brown belted. All right, the next bee that we're going to look at is one of the more complicated bumblebees to identify. And I'm going to just I'm not going to talk about all the things that can vary on this bee, because the reason it's complicated is it does vary quite a bit. But I'm going to talk about what you can usually see on it to help you identify it. There's two morphs. There is a red morph, red-belted bumblebee, and there is a dark morph. The most distinguishing feature is right here. It's an oval-shaped, very large thorax patch, usually reaches from wing pad to wing pad. And it's the only bee that has, in Wisconsin, that has that large oval-shaped patch. And we will look at some photos. And then the other distinguishing feature is T1 will be yellow, and at least the center top part of T2 should be yellow. These can vary widely, the rest of the abdominal sections, but you're looking for that oval thorax patch and then yellow on at least the top center of the second abdominal section. So we have a photo here where you can see that oval thorax patch. Oops. And you could see on that second abdominal section, the top part of T2 is yellow. Let's look at another view of just a beautiful bee. We see that oval thorax patch, and again, the top of T2 is yellow. Now we'll look at the dark morph. And again, we're just going to look at what you're looking for, which is that oval thorax patch, and then T2 is going to be yellow in the center, and it's going to decrease in yellow as it approaches the side. It won't be fully yellow on the side. So again, most important feature right here, that oval-shaped thorax patch, and you can see again on this bee that the yellow is decreasing as it approaches the side. Okay, now we're going to look at our rusty patch bumblebee. And this is actually one of the easier bees to identify because it has some very distinct characteristics. And what you're really going to be looking for here is this thumbtack shaped thorax patch where the tack points down towards the abdomen. And then we're going to be looking on T2. There is a rusty patch. It can vary from light peach color to dark brown to rusty, but it would be bordered by yellow on the bottom and the sides on T2. A side view, again, we're going to look at the important feature here. This is all I need to see to know that I've got a rusty patch. There's the rusty patch in the center of T2, and there's the yellow border that goes on the sides and the bottom. Our overhead view, you can see that thumbtack shape with the point going down towards the abdomen, and then you see the very clear rusty patch bordered by yellow on T2. Our next bee is a half-black bumblebee with a black face, yellow vertex, a small thorax dot, unlike the dark morph of the red morph of the red-belted, and then fully yellow all the way to the sides of the first and second abdominal section. And this picture shows you that small patch. The thorax patch often is arrowhead shaped with the point of the arrow pointing up towards the head. And you can see, you can kind of make out through the wings here that the yellow goes all the way to the edge of that section. That overhead view now of the half black, you get a clear look at that arrowhead shape pointing up towards the head. And then you can see, sometimes this is not uncommon to have black a little bit in the center of the first or second abdominal section, but the yellow reaches all the way to the side. The black and gold bumblebee is our largest bumblebee, and she makes her presence known when she's in the garden with you. You will hear her buzz. She has a black face, a yellow vertex that can kind of, sometimes it looks like little bitty eyebrows of yellow. We'll take a look at that. This very large thorax patch. And then typically T1 is black, sometimes with a little bit of yellow on the very edges. And T2 and 3 are yellow, and the rest of the abdominal section's black. So the distinguishing features here really are this huge thorax patch, and then T1 is typically black, and T2 and 3 yellow. So here's a photo of that. You can see that very large thorax patch. Sometimes the black reaches all the way to the first section, and there isn't even yellow here. You can see T1 is black, and then T2 and 3 are yellow. There's that tiny bit of yellow on the edge of the section, which is not uncommon. And another view, this one gives that example of those little yellow eyebrows that form the vertex. That's a very common feature. And then the thorax patch in this one almost reaches all the way to the abdomen. Okay, and then the last bee that we're going to look at is the yellow bumblebee, which is a Wisconsin imperiled species, meaning that there's concern about its population. If you aren't reporting any other bees to Bumblebee Brigade, if you would report the rusty patched and the yellow, it would be greatly appreciated, because those are bee populations we really want to be keeping an eye on. Yellow has a black face, a black vertex, and then this long, narrow thorax band. And then the really distinguishing feature of a yellow bumblebee is that 1, 2, 3, and 4 abdominal sections are all yellow. There is another bee, a less common bee called the northern amber. It also has these 4 yellow abdominal sections, but there the distinction is it has a yellow face and a yellow vertex. So when it comes to identifying the yellow bumblebee, you want to look at these 4 sections, and you want to make sure you've got a dark face and a dark vertex. There could be a tiny bit of yellow, but essentially dark. All right, let's look at a couple of photos. We've got the dark face, the dark vertex, and then we have those 4 yellow abdominal sections. And another view here, just a beautiful bee. You can see this one has a tiny bit of yellow on the face, but it's still essentially a dark face. All right, that is it. Thank you very much for coming on this bumblebee journey with me. And do we have time for questions? I guess.
Yes.
No. All right.
We don't have very many questions, but if you do have questions and you haven't already, please put them in the chat, and I will address the few that are in here. Right. The first question is, we have 10 acres of grassy area behind our subdivision. How does doing a controlled burn affect the insects and plants? Good or bad?
Well, controlled burns are a regular part of a healthy prairie, and you need to have controlled burns in order to have a healthy prairie. So it's something that you want to make sure you've got the right timing, and I'm not going to try to be an expert right now to say what the exact time is to do the burn, but the healthiest flowers and the healthiest prairies result when there are regular controlled burns done. And that's part of the natural system that occurs in prairies, and it is something that plants and insects are adapted to.
Okay, I had also had heard that the controlled burns do actually affect the insects in that area, but that's why only smaller areas should be done.
Well, and I think you also have to be careful when you're doing, so you want someone that, there's a lot of training that goes into when and how to do burns. And so you want to do the burn at the right time of the year for the insect.
Yeah. Somebody else has asked, where can we purchase Dutchman's breeches?
There are it's not an easy plant to purchase, but there are some native plant. You're going to want to go to a native plant garden. And Wisconsin pollinators and the DNR have lists of native plant sellers on their websites. So I guess I would suggest looking at Wisconsin pollinators website and looking at the DNR website. I'm sure there's a lot of other websites. Wild Ones probably has information on I've got several native plant nurseries that I use, but I guess I don't want to start listing names off right now.
And the listener was in the West Bend area. I've looked online and it looks like Prairie Moon does have seeds for them. Right now their plants are sold out. One thing you do need to keep in mind is that you need to have the right environment for them. They kind of need a boggy, cool, boggy area.
What we have a lot of Dutchman's breeches in our backyard, and they're a woodland flower, and we've got because we have left the leaves and we have left the plant debris. It's not a boggy area, but it's a very rich humus soil there because of all those years, of just allowing the natural plant debris to decompose back there, and they grow very well in our backyard. So I think that if you have used that soft landings concept, and if you can create a good humus soil there, I know that our Dutchman's breeches grow and spread very well, in the woodland backyard that we have.
That's good. I have a question. Why do the male bees die after mating or after the season? And that is asked by Waylon, who's 8 years old.
Well, what happens with bumblebees is the only bees that survive are those new queens. So the way they've evolved is it's called an annual life cycle. And all of the female workers, this year's queen, and all of the males have evolved so that their whole goal is to produce those females who will be the queens, who will be able to overwinter and start the cycle again the next spring.
Someone has recommended your Facebook page as a good source of information. So make sure if you're on Facebook, that you like that page. Somebody else said they're thanking you and said you didn't cover Pennsylvanicus, but do you have tips for distinguishing that
Yes.
from
I can give you some quick tips. They're a fairly uncommon bee in Wisconsin, so we didn't cover them, but they look a lot like that black and gold bumblebee that we looked at. And the quick tip is they have an entirely black vertex, not a spot of yellow in it. So if you see those little yellow eyebrows, then you have a black and gold. If you have a completely black vertex, there's a good chance, it's not certain, but there's a good chance it's a Pennsylvanicus.
Someone else says, do honeybees compete for resources or otherwise inhibit native bumblebees?
Well, I guess the answer to that is yes. I mean, if they're using the same flowers, there is going to be some level of competition that goes on, and honeybees are not native bees. They, for the most part, were introduced for agricultural purposes, in our country. So Yep, I guess like any situation, if you're looking for the same resources and while they're not exactly the same, they're very similar and sometimes they are the same flowers being used. Once, depending upon the cycle that a flower has of producing the pollen and nectar, once it's been used for that day or the period, that the flower is producing, it's not available for the next insect.
You have a lot of thank yous. And somebody lists a source near De Pere of stonesiloprairie.com.
I've heard good things about them.
Suzanne Carpenter says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. And she saw her first bumblebee queen today, a black and gold bumblebee in the Arboretum.
Excellent.
Any other questions? I don't see any more. So on that, I think that we will end our recording. And thank you very much, Judy, for your presentation. It was very informative. I have a lot of bees in my yard. I had no way of knowing what they were. So now I'm going to actually start taking some pictures and trying to identify them.
Great. Good. Thank you.
I'll join your bumblebee brigade. All right. Thank you. I think I have to stop here. Stop recording.